She was 20 years old, and she had $11 to her name, and she was standing at the edge of the Arizona Territory desert with a bedroll, a cracked water skin, and nowhere left in the world that would have her. Her uncle, Elias Renshaw, the man who had taken her in after her father's death and then decided within a single dry season that a niece was a burden he no longer wished to carry, had put her out of his house with a wagon ride to the edge of town and a warning never to darken his door again. All she carried from 6 years under his roof was what fit in one canvas sack, and all she carried from her father was a small tin box of tools and the sound of his voice telling her that a thing worth having is rarely a thing that looks worth having. So when the clerk at the land office told her that 40 acres out past Coyote Flat could be hers for $8, because the well on it was said to be dry and the cabin on it had fallen to ruin, she did not hesitate, though every soul in town called it a fool's purchase. She did not know, not yet, that beneath that broken homestead lay something sealed away on purpose, something that would not only save her life, but would save an entire drought-starved county and bring low the very man who had cast her out. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marisol Duarte. If you have ever been told that you were worth less than the trouble you caused, and found out later that you were wrong, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Marisol Duarte, Mari to anyone who loved her, and there had once been more of those than she could count on both hands, had been born in the spring of 1867 in a 2-room adobe house at the edge of a town called Solitude in the Arizona Territory, in a valley where the Santa Rosa Hills folded down toward a wide dry basin that filled, in good years, with more grass than a person could believe possible in a place so brown and so hard the rest of the time. Her father, Tomas Duarte, had been a stonemason and a well digger, a man whose hands knew water the way other men's hands knew scripture. It was from him that Mari learned the 2 things that would carry her through everything that came after: how to read the land for what it was hiding, and how to work quietly and patiently at a thing until it gave up its secret. Her mother had died when Mari was 6, of a fever that took half the babies and a good many of the grown in Solitude that terrible summer. And after that it had been Mari and her father, moving from ranch to ranch and town to town, wherever there was a well to be sunk or a spring to be coaxed back to life, sleeping some nights under wagons and other nights, when the work was good, in a rented room with a real roof. Tomas Duarte was not a rich man, not by the reckoning of the banks or the land offices, but he was known and respected across 3 counties, because a well dubbed by Tomas Duarte was a well that would still be giving water 20 years on, and because he never once, in all his years of work, charged a widow or an orphaned family the full price of his labor. He used to tell Mari, crouched beside her at the lip of some half-finished shaft with a lantern throwing gold light up the earthen walls, that water does not announce itself. It hides under rock that looks barren, under sand that looks used up, under land that everyone else has already walked past and judged worthless. A man who only trusts what looks valuable, he told her, will die thirsty beside a fortune. It was a lesson she turned over so many times in her mind as a girl that by the time she was 14, sitting beside him with a dowsing rod he only half believed in and a spirit level he trusted completely, she could read a stretch of ground and tell you, more often than not, where the water wanted to be. He taught her to read a survey map, too, and to understand the strange old Spanish and Mexican land grants that still lingered like ghosts across the territory's paperwork, tracts that had been given to families generations back, then abandoned, then absorbed, then forgotten, their boundaries sometimes marked by nothing more than a pile of stones or a dead cottonwood that had long since fallen. He taught her carpentry enough to build a door that would not warp in the dry heat, and masonry enough to lay a foundation that would not crack when the ground froze hard in January and then split wide open again in July. And more than any of it, he taught her that a young woman with steady hands and a patient mind was not less capable than a man twice her age, whatever the men of Solitude might have believed, and he never once let her believe otherwise. When she was 17, and Tomas Duarte's cough had settled into his chest and would not leave, it was Mari who finished the last well he ever started, working 3 days alone in a shaft narrow enough that only a slight young woman could fit down into it, striking water on the 3rd day at a depth every man in the county had told her was hopeless. Her father died 2 months later, in the autumn of 1884, with his hand in hers, and the last thing he told her, in a voice gone thin as paper, was that she was to remember, worthless is only ever an opinion, and opinions are wrong more often than they are right. With her father gone, Mari had nowhere to be and no one to belong to, until her father's younger brother, Elias Renshaw, for he was her mother's half-brother by a second marriage, and had taken the Renshaw name from his own father, arrived from Prescott with a black suit and a great show of grief and an offer to take his niece in. Elias was, by the standards of the territory, a man of substantial means. He had built a modest fortune buying up cheap, played-out land throughout the valley and holding it, patiently, for reasons he never fully explained even to his own family, and he owned the mercantile in Solitude besides. Mari, 17 and grieving and with no better choice in front of her, went to live in his house, and for a time she was grateful, and she worked hard to earn her keep, cooking and keeping his ledgers and mending harness, never once suspecting that her uncle's kindness had never been kindness at all, but calculation, though it would be years before she understood what that calculation had truly been for. For 3 years Mari lived under Elias Renshaw's roof in a kind of watchful peace, doing the work of a housekeeper and a bookkeeper both, while her uncle's business dealings grew stranger and more secretive with each passing season. She noticed things a girl less trained by her father might have missed. That Elias bought up parcels of desert land throughout the Coyote Flat Basin that no sane rancher would want, land the county assessors had marked as worthless scrub, and that he did so quietly, through other men's names, never his own. She noticed that he grew short-tempered and evasive whenever the subject of the old Alvarado land grant came up, a stretch of abandoned homestead ground out past the flat that had belonged, so the old-timers said, to a Spanish family who had vanished from the valley 2 generations back. She noticed, too, that the drought that had settled over the whole county for 3 years running seemed, in some way she could not explain, to serve her uncle's purposes rather than harm them, for as ranchers failed and sold out cheap, it was always Elias, or men working quietly for Elias, who bought their land. It was in the spring of 1887, when Mari was 20 years old, that everything came apart at once. She had begun, in her quiet way, asking questions of the county clerk, of the old freighters who passed through Solitude, of a kind elderly woman named Dona Inés Alvarado's last surviving grandniece, who lived 2 towns over and remembered stories her own grandmother had told about a spring on the family land that had simply, mysteriously, gone dry the very year the Alvarados left the valley for good. Mari did not yet understand what she was circling, only that something did not sit right, the way a floorboard does not sit right over a space that has been dug out beneath it. And it was on an evening in April, when she asked her uncle directly, over supper, why he had never once let a surveyor set foot on the old Alvarado ground he had quietly acquired the deed to years before, that Elias Renshaw's careful mask slipped, and something cold and furious looked out at her from behind his eyes. He did not strike her. He did not need to. He told her, in a voice gone flat and final, that she had grown too curious for a girl who owed him everything, that she had clearly inherited her father's habit of poking at things better left buried, and that a household had no room for a niece who could not learn to be grateful and silent. Within the week, he had packed her few belongings into a wagon himself, driven her to the edge of town, and left her there with a warning that echoed her father's words back at her in the ugliest possible way, that she was worth nothing to him now, and never would be again. Mari stood in the road outside Solitude with her father's tin box of tools, $11 folded in a handkerchief, and the terrible, dizzying knowledge that the man who had raised her for 3 years had never loved her at all, only watched her, waiting to see how much she knew. She spent 2 nights sleeping in the loft of a stable that belonged to a kindly freighter named Obed Kinney, who fed her and asked no questions and pointed her, on the 3rd morning, toward the land office in the crossroads town of Marrow's Bend, saying that a person with almost nothing sometimes had to buy almost nothing, and hope it turned out to be worth more than it looked. It was there, standing at the counter with her $11, that the clerk, a narrow, bored young man named Tobias Greer, pushed a ledger across to her and told her, with the particular scorn reserved for those about to make a fool's bargain, that there was a 40-acre parcel out past Coyote Flat going for $8, on account of the well being dry, the cabin fallen in, and no soul in 3 years having wanted it at any price. He said its old name in the county books was the Alvarado claim, and that it was cursed, some said, on account of the family that had once worked at vanishing so completely and so fast that nobody rightly knew where they'd gone. Mari's hand did not shake as she counted out the $8, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, for she had heard that name, Alvarado, only weeks before, from her own trembling questions at her uncle's table, and from an old woman 2 towns over who remembered a spring that had died the very year the family disappeared. She signed a claim under her own name, Marisol Duarte, and rode out to it that same afternoon on a borrowed mule, with $3 left in her pocket and nothing else in the world but her father's tools and a feeling, deep and quiet as a well shaft, that she was walking towards something her uncle had spent years trying to keep buried. The land itself, when she reached it in the long gold light of that April evening, looked every bit as worthless as the clerk had promised. The cabin was little more than 4 collapsing adobe walls and a roof that had caved in on one corner, home to pack rats and a family of owls that watched her from the rafters with unblinking suspicion. The yard was choked with cholla and dead mesquite, and the well, a stone-lined shaft near the northeast corner of the house, was capped over with a heavy wooden platform that had been nailed down and then, Mari noted with the trained eye her father had given her, sealed further with a layer of adobe mud plastered clean over every seam, as though someone had wanted not merely to cover the well, but to erase the fact that it had ever been a well at all. She spent her first night in the ruined cabin wrapped in her one blanket, listening to the coyotes and the wind moving through the broken roof, and telling herself that whatever she found here, she would find it with her own hands, the way her father had taught her, patiently, and without expecting the world to hand her anything for free. In the days that followed, Mari set to work clearing the cabin enough to make it livable, trading 2 days of hard labor to Obed Kinney's cousin, a carpenter, for the loan of tools and a little flour and salt pork in exchange for helping mend his fence line. And it was while clearing the collapsed corner of the cabin's back room, prying up a section of rotted floorboard that had buckled with age, that she found the first clue, a small tin box, not unlike her own father's, tucked into a hollow. Beneath the boards, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with the years. Inside it she found a woman's rosary, a folded letter written in a careful, looping Spanish hand, and a hand-drawn map of the property showing the cabin, the well, and, marked with a small cross a good 60 paces to the east, out past a stand of dead mesquite. A second point labeled only El Ojo, the eye, in ink gone brown with age. That night, by the light of a tallow candle, Mari worked slowly through the letter with the little Spanish her father had taught her and the help of a small dictionary she had carried since childhood. And what she pieced together sent a chill down her spine despite the desert heat still radiating off the walls. The letter was from Dona Inés Alvarado herself, written, it seemed, in the last year the family had lived on the land, addressed to no one in particular, as though she had meant it as a record rather than a letter to be sent. It spoke of a spring, the true spring, the eye of the land, the one that fed the shallow well near the house only as an overflow, that lay hidden in a rock outcrop east of the cabin, capped by the Alvarado family generations before to protect it from a feud with a neighboring rancher, and reopened only in times of true need. It spoke, too, of a man. She named him only as El Comprador, the buyer, who had come to the family in the year of the great drought offering to purchase their land for a price so low it was an insult, and who had grown strange and threatening when Dona Inés refused, hinting that he knew things about the family's water rights that could be used against them in the territorial courts. The letter ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as though Dona Inés had been interrupted and never returned to finish it. Mari sat with that letter until the candle burned down to nothing, turning it over and over in her mind alongside everything she had noticed in her uncle's house. The secret purchases, the drought that never seemed to hurt him, his fury when she asked about the Alvarado land, and by the time the desert sky outside had gone the deep, star-crowded black of a moonless night, she understood, with the terrible clarity of a puzzle finally solved, exactly what her uncle Elias Renshaw had done. He had found out, somehow, about the hidden spring, and rather than pay the Alvarado family a fair price for land that held the only reliable water source in the entire Coyote Flat Basin, he had used whatever leverage he held, legal, financial, or worse, to drive the family out, buy the land for almost nothing under a false name, and then quietly buy up every other parcel in the drought-stricken valley around it for years afterward, waiting, with the patience of a man who already knew where true wealth lay hidden, for the day the whole basin would be worth a fortune once the water question was finally settled in his favor. He had let the county believe the land was cursed and the well was dry. He had let 3 years of drought grind down his neighbors into desperate sellers. And he had, without ever meaning to, sold the one piece of land holding his secret to the one person in the territory capable of reading it. It took her 4 days to find the spring, working from Dona Inés's map with a shovel, a pick, and the dowsing instinct her father had trained in her since girlhood, clearing brush and prying loose a cap of flat stones set into the rock outcrop that had, over the decades, been half buried by wind-blown sand until it looked like nothing more than an outcropping of natural rock. On the 4th evening, with her hands blistered and her back aching and the light going long and amber across the flat, the last stone came free, and a breath of cool, mineral-sweet air rose up out of the darkness beneath it, and far down in the shaft, faint but unmistakable, she heard the soft, patient sound of water. She stood a long while at the mouth of that reopened shaft before she did anything else, letting the cool breath of the spring move over her face while the last color drained slow and violet out of the western sky, and she found herself speaking aloud to no one, the way she had sometimes caught her father doing at the bottom of a well he had just brought in, thanking the ground itself, and thanking Dona Inés Alvarado, a woman dead or vanished she would likely never meet, for trusting a stranger's hand with a secret she had guarded her whole life. She did not go to town shouting the news, for she understood, better than most, what a discovery like this could cost a young woman with no family and no protection standing behind her. Instead, she spent the following week quietly, carefully confirming what she had found, testing the water's flow, tracing with a length of cord and her father's old methods how the spring fed both the capped well near the cabin and, she suspected, a deeper aquifer running beneath much of the flat, which was why the whole basin had gone from fertile to barren the very year the Alvarado Spring had been sealed shut. She rode to the county recorder's office in Marrow's Bend and, working carefully and without revealing her full hand, confirmed that the Alvarado land grant and the water rights attached to it under the old Spanish and Mexican law still recognized by the territorial courts had never been properly transferred, only sold under a name, Josiah Cole, that existed nowhere else in the county's records. A name Mari now strongly suspected was one of the false fronts her uncle had used for years to hide his purchases. Word travels fast in a small basin, even when a person tries to keep quiet, and it was not long before Elias Renshaw learned that his niece had bought the old Alvarado claim, and not much longer after that before he understood, with a dread that must have felt like the ground opening beneath his own feet, exactly what she might find there. He came to her himself, riding out to Coyote Flat on a hot morning in early May with 2 of his hired men trailing behind him, and found Mari standing at the mouth of the reopened spring with mud on her hands and a fierce, steady calm in her eyes that he had never once seen in her before and did not know what to do with. He offered her money first, $100, then $500, sums that would have seemed a fortune to the girl he had put out on the road only weeks before, to sign the land back over to him, quietly, before word of the water spread any further. When she refused, gently but without a shred of doubt in her voice, he turned to threats, telling her that a young woman alone, with no family standing behind her claim, could easily find her deed disputed in the territorial courts, her water rights tied up for years, her reputation in the valley quietly ruined by a man with his standing and his connections in Prescott. But Mari had learned patience from her father, and she had learned, in the weeks since her uncle put her out, that fear loses its grip on a person once they understand exactly what they are afraid of. She told Elias, standing her ground at the mouth of the spring with the whole dry basin stretched out gold and silent behind her, that she had already sent copies of Dona Inés Alvarado's letter, along with her own notes on the false name Josiah Cole and the pattern of his land purchases across the valley, to a territorial land attorney in Prescott, a Mrs. Adeline Foss, whose name she had gotten from Obed Kinney and who had, as it happened, made something of a specialty of defending small claimants against exactly the kind of quiet, patient fraud her uncle had been practicing for years. She told him, too, that she had spoken already with the surviving Alvarado grandniece, who was prepared to swear to the family's history and to the water rights that had never lawfully left their name. Elias Renshaw's face, Maury would say later, went the color of old ash, and he left without another word, though not before one of his hired men, a rough sort named Purdy, muttered a warning as they rode off that a person could have an accident out on land this lonely, and no one would ever know. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Maury's young life, harder even in the days right after her father's death, for she now had to fight not only the desert and her own uncertainty, but a man with money and standing who had every reason to want her silenced. She did not do it alone. Mrs. Adeline Foss, once she read the letter and the notes Maury had sent, took up the case with a fire that surprised even Maury, filing petitions with the Territorial Land Office to formally recognize the Alvarado water rights and to investigate the string of suspicious sales tied to the name Josiah Cole. The Alvarado grandniece, an elderly, sharp-eyed woman named Rosalinda Pacheco, came herself by stagecoach to Merrow's Bend to give sworn testimony to her family's history and the wrong that had been done them. And the ranchers of the Coyote Flat Basin, once they understood, through the careful, quiet way news of a live spring travels through a drought-stricken valley, that water might finally be within reach again, began arriving at Maury's cabin themselves, first out of curiosity, then out of hope, then, one family at a time, to help her clear brush and shore up the old well shaft and haul stone for a proper cistern, in a spirit of neighborliness that had gone dry in the valley right alongside its wells. In the days before the hearing, the pressure on Maury grew heavier than it had been at any point since she had first pried up the well cap and heard water moving in the dark. Purdy and another of her uncle's hired men took to riding the road past her cabin at odd hours, saying nothing, only watching, and one night, in the middle of June, someone crept in her half-fenced corral and let loose the 2 mules she had bought on credit to help haul stone for the cistern, so that she and Obed Kinney's cousin spent a full day tracking them across the flat instead of finishing the channel work the ranchers were counting on. A notice appeared, and signed, tacked to the door of the Merrow's Bend land office, questioning whether a young, unmarried woman ought to be trusted to hold so valuable a claim at all, hinting that the land might be better administered by a guardian of more established standing, and Maury understood well enough whose hand, however carefully hidden, lay behind the wording. She did not answer any of it with anger, for her father had taught her that a person trying to frighten you is usually a person who has run out of honest arguments, and instead she answered it with work, with witnesses gathered, with the channel finished a week ahead of schedule with the help of 6 ranching families who had grown tired of waiting on someone else to save them, and with a steadiness that, more than any single piece of evidence, began to turn the valley's sympathy fully toward her. Elias Renshaw did not give up easily. He tried, through a lawyer of his own, to argue that the original sale to Josiah Cole had been entirely legal, and that any water rights attached to the Alvarado land had passed lawfully to him regardless of what family history Rosalinda Pacheco might recall. He tried, too, in the weeks before the territorial hearing, a quieter and uglier campaign, spreading word through solitude that his niece was unstable, that she had always been strange and grasping even as a girl, hoping to poison the well of public opinion before the water itself could clear his name from suspicion. But the ranchers who had spent 3 dry years watching their herds thin and their children go hungry were not, in the end, inclined to take the word of the man whose own land purchases had so conveniently multiplied throughout the drought, and when the hearing finally came, in the last week of June, held in the crowded back room of the Merrow's Bend land office with half the valley crowded in to hear it. It took the territorial examiner less than an hour, once Dona Inés's letter and Rosalinda Pacheco's testimony and the county's own suspiciously thin records on one Josiah Cole were laid out together to rule that the Alvarado water rights had never lawfully passed from the family, and that Marisol Duarte, as the current and rightful holder of the Alvarado land grant, held clear and undisputed claim to the spring. When the examiner read his ruling aloud, Mari did not smile or weep or say a single word, only sat very still with her hands folded in her lap the way her father used to sit at the bottom of a finished well, listening to water find its own level, and let the room's long, unburdened silence tell her everything she needed to know. Elias Renshaw did not go to prison, for the fraud, however plain to every soul in that crowded room, had been built too carefully and too long ago to be proven beyond the shadow the territorial law required. But he did not need prison to feel the weight of what he had done. Word of the hearing spread through 3 counties within a month, and no rancher in the valley, having heard how he had let his own neighbors suffer through a drought his secrecy had worsened, would do business with him again on any terms. The mercantile in Solitude lost half its trade within the season, and by the following spring, Elias Renshaw had sold his remaining land, the very parcels he had spent years quietly gathering, at a fraction of what he had paid for them, and left the territory altogether, a broken and friendless man undone not by violence or by law but by the plain. Patient truth finally being told in a room full of people who had every reason to want to hear it. Mari, for her part, did not let the spring make her rich in the way her uncle had once dreamed of being rich, hoarding water and land and waiting for others to grow desperate enough to pay any price. She thought often, in those first weeks after the ruling, of the letter Dona Inés had left unfinished beneath the floorboards, and of how easily that hidden truth might have stayed buried forever had her uncle's own greed not driven him, without meaning to sell the one parcel capable of exposing him. And she resolved that whatever she built on the Alvarado land from that day forward would be built in the open, with nothing worth knowing ever again sealed away from the people it belonged to. She had learned a different lesson from her father, one about the true value of things overlooked, and she put it into practice from the very first council she held with her neighbors that summer, sitting on upturned crates in the shade of her half-rebuilt cabin. That the spring would be shared, its water piped, and channeled fairly to every ranch in the basin according to need rather than according to wealth, with Mari herself holding the deed and the responsibility of the land, but never the right to withhold water from a family in want. She hired local hands, the very ranchers who had once called her purchase a fool's bargain, to help her dig the channels and build the cisterns, paying them fairly and teaching willing hands, the way her father had taught her how to read the ground for what it hid rather than what it showed. Within 2 years, Coyote Flat, once the driest and most despised stretch of the county, had become its most fertile, its grass returned, its cattle fattened, its families no longer counting the days until the next well ran dry. And Marisol Duarte, the girl who had been cast out with $11 and a fool's purchase, was by every honest measure the valley could reckon the richest person in the county, not merely in the value of her land, but in the plain currency of gratitude and trust, that a person cannot buy at any land office at any price. And so we come back to where we began, to a 20-year-old woman standing at the edge of the desert with almost nothing, buying a broken-down claim that every soul in 3 counties called worthless because her father had taught her that water does not announce itself, that value hides most often in the places least expected to hold it, and that a person's worth is never truly decided by the ones who cast them out. Marisol Duarte did not find a fortune buried beneath that ruined cabin so much as she uncovered a truth that had been buried on purpose, sealed shut by a man who understood the value of what he was hiding and counted on the rest of the world never looking closely enough to find it. What she built afterward, not just a working ranch, not just a restored spring, but a whole valley's worth of trust rebuilt one fair season at a time, was a truer inheritance her father had left her, more lasting than any well he had ever dug. The patient, stubborn belief that overlooked things and overlooked people are so often worth more than anyone around them has bothered to imagine. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Marisol Duarte's story tonight. If her patience and her father's quiet wisdom, and the slow unearthing of a truth that had been buried on purpose meant something to you. We would be glad if you shared this story with someone who might need to hear it, and we would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them, and we're grateful, always, for the time you spend with us. Until next time, stay close.